So Robert Schleip, I'm so excited to be speaking with this gentleman today. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to
Wonderful.
reconnect with you. So, since we have been together on this train, on this adventure since at least 2005. And
Yes.
I hope you are using this podcast to reflect on where it has been taking us and many other co-travelers on this adventurous trip.
Indeed. I mean, that's sort of what I want to do is kind of go back to then come back to this present moment. I'm always one of those fans to say, no, you have to stay very present because this is where everything happens. But I want to go back because you and your work has been so instrumental, not only just to me, but to so many people in the industry, and all of the work that you've contributed along with Tom Findley. You two are very instrumental in, I think, encouraging me with the ideas that I had that when I had met you, it was right after you wrote the first part of the 2003 fascial plasticity article about a new neurobiological explanation of fascia. And I remember when Tom Findley had sent that to me, I just was like, there it was, like, here's this researcher, who's this guy? And I'm not sure if it was Gil Hadley or Tom Findley, but somebody gave me your home phone number, and I had called you, and you answered the phone, spoke to me, and subsequently in 2005, you had come to my office and sat with me for a couple hours in my office.
There, and you introduced me to the melt treatment, and
Yes.
I was deeply impressed.
Thank you.
I remember that. Yeah. You had me do my feet and my lower arms and my hands. And I could tell this is not just one more invention. It's a really eye-opener, very powerful tool that you invented then.
Thank you. Well, and I have to say that a lot of the work, I always say that I was taking clinical research and trying to apply it. And so I feel like a lot of what I developed was out of the things that I had read in your research paper. And of course, Tom Findley, who we should acknowledge here for a second, Tom and Robert were the co-founders of the Fascia Research Society. And I remember being on a call with you and Gil and Tom Findley, or Tom Myers was also on, and I think Diane Lee was on the call. And Tom had said, we need to create a Congress to bring researchers together to share their work. And I think it was Tom Myers who laughed out loud, and he said, so you want researchers to come and share their work? It's like unheard of. Yet not only has this happened, it's continued to happen. And I feel like I am sitting and witnessing a massive movement, a pioneering shift in perspective over the past 25 years. Yet it's been going on for far longer than that. So can you speak a little bit about how the Fascia Congress and all of this research from back when you started to where it is today, just like where's the origin of the Fascia Congress?
Well, the fascia is not new. I think everybody is aware who is listening to that. Many people before us had been aware that it is everywhere in the human body, and that traditional Western medicine gives it only a limited function in holding things together, but that you can understand the rest of the body by cutting it respectfully aside and then studying the muscles without the fascia. And so many people before us, Andrew Taylor still, Ida Rolf, many smart, very, very bright people in complementary medicine knew that fascia is much, much more. But of course, it had not been embraced by classical Western medicine that wants to objectively measure things. And there were many people who thought this would be a worthwhile exploration, to get well-equipped Western scientists to study fascia, not with their hands, not with their intuition and their own felt sense, but with the highly evidence-based, quantified measuring tools that Western science has available.
Yeah, well,
And I,
isn't that it, right? That science
yeah,
needs to measure, right? And if you can't
yeah,
measure it, if you
yeah.
can't quantify it, they don't care what a therapist says. If you can't measure it, put it in a lab and define it, then it doesn't
Mm.
exist. But here you are.
And not quite. That's what many people in the complementary field think is the arrogant status of evidence-based medicine. And that's why we didn't communicate very well with them. But even till the end, Tom Findley and also us, we knew that evidence-based medicine is not arrogant. It is very careful about making distinctions. And the majority of the real good scientists are not saying, I don't care, but they say it is on more shaky grounds if you only feel it on yourself, because so many corroborating factors can, wishful thinking is very prominent in the whole measuring field. And Tom knew that. I knew it from my 5 years of academic psychology study. So evidence-based medicine only makes distinctions. How solid is the proof? And if it is not based on quantified measurements, you are more careful about claiming this is a reliable fact. So Tom and I, we were very respectful about science, and we felt that we have a useful perspective in a humble way to bring into conventional science. The new perspective that Ida Rolf, Andrew Taylor Still, many people in our field had been aware of. And before Tom and us, many people thought science is arrogant, they are blinded, they are closed minds, and we need to teach, and we need to teach them how to study fascia, We need to go in a dialogue, and they should shut up, and we tell them how fascia is functioning. And Tom never did that. He spent the majority in his life as a scientist, and he always relied on very careful, quantified measuring, and always thinking, could we be jumping prematurely too early into conclusions based on the measurements that we did, based on our own felt sense, etc. And I think that was what the people that we contacted, and I could have never done it myself, because Tom had much better connections to many of them, and they trusted him because he smelled like one of them to them.
Well, he was a stickler to detail. I mean, developing research papers and making sure that you were keeping the parameters, right? I remember when I approached him about doing the research paper the first time, which was in 2008. It took me until 2015 for him to finally say okay to it. And he said, you need to keep your parameters much smaller. You can't define everything. You need to break it down. So he's like, you just have to be willing to take small steps in the right direction and not be so into a full conclusion. And it was really one of the biggest lessons that he, I think, offered to me. One thing that Robert, you're talking about here, and I want to see if I can get you to talk a little bit about this. When I met Tom, I had formed a hypothesis in my mind where I always thought, and again, my school of thought is in neuromuscular therapy, and this sensory motor feedback and these free nerve endings in the body are what adapt. And it's all about the nervous system. It has, that's the thing that's adapting. So when I stumbled upon this emerging field of fascial science and research, I'm reading it going, wow, that actually sounds like something more, because in my background, I was told that, just like you said, fascia was this passive packing material. It was this inert substance. I remember hearing it called a non-cellular system, like it was a non-living matter. And I recall Gil saying, why would you have a non-living matter living in your body? And I was like, that actually doesn't make any sense. So in your research paper, I think one of the key things that really solidified to me, and I think that it it isn't talked about still in the community of fitness enough because everybody's still hell-bent on just talking myofascia. You had really landed, and the thing that solidified it for me was that you had said fascia and the autonomic nervous system appear to be intimately connected, right? And that there's this change in attitude of, myofascial practitioners from this mechanical perspective to this more inclusive concept of self-regulatory dynamics of the nervous system. And one of the biggest things was the idea that, yes, when you're a therapist, you feel this tissue adaptation, but is the tissue that's adapting? And if it is, why is it adapting? And there's a lot of study on this word called mechanoreception, these mechanoreceptors, these free nerve endings. Can you, I think that's an elusive thing, because if we're talking about sensory nerves and mechanoreceptors, that's a nervous system thing. But and when I was in school, I thought all the mechanoreceptors were in muscle. And now we're saying, nope, there's 10 times more in fascia. How does that change when you're saying this is a new neurobiological explanation? Why is that so different in concept?
A lot of studies have been done on dead fascia. For example, yesterday I debated with a colleague the statement that's out in the social media only, that you cannot stretch the IT band. Everybody who is in the physio field is repeating that slogan after Paul Ingraham started it in 2008, where he quoted a paper from Tom Findley, Hans Chaudhary, and me, where we used dead meat and stretched it. And there we showed that if you want to stretch dead meat IT band, you would need longer forces or longer times than we have available during manual therapy. But of course, when you practice roughing manipulation, you can feel a release under your hand. And that's the difference when you work on dead meat and when you work on living patients. So everybody who thinks there is no difference, I invite you to get some meat from the slaughterhouse. I have done that as a vegetarian for years in my study, and try to rough them and see how much pressure it takes to get any change under your hands. It's possible. And then do it with a living person or a living tissue. And of course, there is a big difference. And one difference, not the only one, is that there are mechanical sensitive nerve endings included, not only free nerve endings, but also Golgi, Pacini, muscle spindles sometimes, not so much in fascia, who can then communicate with the rest of the nervous system and of the physiological adaptation to result in muscle tonus changes, hydration changes, and many other changes that you may then feel under your hand. So that was part of the article I did in 2004, because that was a koan for me when I worked on dead tissue and when I work on living tissue. It was an eye-opener when I did some experiments in the early 2000s years in Australia as a Feldenkrais practitioner and a rolfer. I had a chance to work with fascial tissues on people under complete anesthesia. And then the active muscle tonus is blocked off. And also the mechanoreceptors cannot communicate with the central nervous system. But the rest, the collagen fibers, are all the same. Hyaluronan should be the same. And there was a big difference, of course, in the way how it responded to my manipulation, but also in range of motion. So that was a big eye-opener for me, that the nervous system plays a big role. Anesthesia is a living person minus the nervous system connection to the central nervous system from the tissue. Everything else is the same, pretty much.
So when you talk about mechanoreceptors, are we talking about the fascial system or the nervous system?
I'm talking about the mechanosensitive nerve endings in fascial tissues or in the locomotor system. And as you already indicated, some people quoted me that I had said it 10 times. Tom Myers published that many years ago, and he gave the reference to Jaap van der Waal. But I had studied, the doctor sees everything from Jaap van der Waal. So I chased both of them. Where is the number 10 times coming from. And Jaap said, I never said it. Then Tom Meyer said, I think, Robert, I got it from you. And then I was back chasing my own tail. So finally, I used 3 afternoons several years ago to do the calculation myself, based on the best available quantifying innovation data that I had, and I published them. And it's 6 times more sensory nerve endings in fascial tissue if you allow the muscle spindles to be associated with muscle tissue or muscle fibers. So they are the only mechanoreceptors where you could argue that they are not in the fascial system, but they are in the muscle tissue. They are not in muscle fibers. And the stakeholders argue even the muscle spindles are embedded in the intramuscular fascial tissue called perimuseum, and then it would be 1 million to nothing. So the number of 6 to 1 only relates to the number of muscle spindles compared with all other mechanoreceptor nerve endings which are embedded in the locomotor system. And in the past we thought they are in the skin mostly, that they are in the joint receptors, but now we know they are in what we call the fascial system, including intramuscular connective tissue. A lot of them are under the skin.
And yeah, I think that you've pissed off a lot of neuroscientists is what I think happened, because what I saw in a short period of time, and this was earlier on, right? I remember presenting some of your work, and it was after the 2007 first Fascia Congress. I had the opportunity to go to Penn State and present some of this new information. And the anatomist who was there was up in a huff. He actually stood up and said, everything she's talking about is a fallacy. None of this stuff is scientifically based. I was like, no, these are research papers. These are researchers who are talking about this. And I've said the word they've proposed. There's no factual anything. I don't think science is there to create facts. I think it's there to measure, to give us ways to quantify things so that we ask more questions and create more research to gain more information. So why do you think that the win as fascia and the concepts of fascia being important to neural responsiveness, to stability, to function, why do you think it got so, why did it disrupt the musculoskeletal, the traditional anatomy? Why is that inclusion so frustrating for some people to shift to this idea that this 3-dimensional system is actually more important than just a passive packing material?
It's not my experience. I'm communicating as a complementary therapist for over 30 years, a lot with what you would call narrow-minded classical anatomists. And I don't see them being pissed off unless you talk to them in an arrogant manner. And maybe some of us did that. That you talk to them in a way where you're not humble, where you don't say, this is my experience, and I know you're representing hundreds of years of people who dedicated their life to improve the method of scientific measurement and asking questions. So Tom and I, when we talk to conventional anatomists who believe that proprioception, for example, is mostly in the muscle spindles and mostly in the joint capsule, they are very open-minded. They say, hey, we are all looking for research together. We are standing on the best research available today. But let me see the facts, the measurements that you have now, that, if it's good data, I'm willing to improve. I'm willing to learn from you guys. So that is my experience. You may have a different experience. But you need to come with a very respectful attitude to the scientist. Of course, there are very closed minds in their circles, probably not more than we have in complementary and in the esoteric circles where I grew up. You also have people who are full of themselves and who have boxes and explanations for everything and who are not eager to learn and to say, oh, I've been wrong, how exciting. So you find these closed minds in the scientific field, but they are not the majority, and they are not more than in our field.
I was going to say, yeah, most of the ones that are disregarding it are the ones that just don't want to learn anything new, and actually have stopped looking at new research and have stopped being progressive. They're kind of in their box, and that they don't want to learn. So I agree with you there. Now you said a word I want to make sure.
So in my experience from the last 30 years in communicating with them very often, I think if you approach them with a respect, there's the same kind, and it's not only a manner of communication, it's a deep attitude from people like Tom and me and others, that we feel we have a humble contribution, and these people, there is more we can learn from them about fascia than the other way around. So if you have that attitude, let's go in a dialogue. Then those people who are closed off and think this is not fitting there, they are less than 10%. 90% of them are very appreciative.
Well said, indeed. And I think that's it. I think that from Tom, what I always learned was, if you create rapport and you just realize that there's, you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know until you know it. So keep looking for the answers and keep connecting. And I really feel like that to me is the beauty of the Fascia Congress, was this idea of bringing people together and to question and to continue to ask and to like this need for more research. I think that if anything, the research has shown us that we actually need more research. And with the atomic force microscopy and all of these new ways to look at fascia, and you had mentioned Carla Stecco, and I thought something that I had brought up to my community was saying, just a couple of years ago, the 2018 Fascia Congress, they're discovering new cells that they're just now defining. I mean, stop and think about that, right? We're in modern times, and we're still discovering cells in the human body that have gone undefined. And don't think that that's going to be the last new cell defined. We're learning more and more and more. Now, something that you had mentioned, I want you to talk a little bit about, is this word proprioception, right? I've now in modern times, I'm hearing other words: interoception, exteroception, nociception, proprioception, mechanoreception. There's all these different receptors, and even how we're defining those seems to me like the definition of it is expanding, and also significantly because of the research in fascia. So can you help anyone who's listening to understand what proprioceptors are, and this new understanding that that proprioception is in fact a component of the fascial system, not just the muscle system?
So proprioception research is part of neurophysiology, but also of psychology. And I had the great privilege, after my 5 years of academic psychology, to be collaborating with the Max Planck Institute here in Munich. And they had 4 days Ian Waterman there, who is the most famous patient who contributed to our current knowledge about proprioception, because this man, at the age of 23, he had an overreaction of his immune system that basically killed most of the proprioceptive nerve endings below his neck. And so a lot of what we learned about the value and the importance of feeling our own body in relationship to the outer space and to gravity, which is usually called proprioception, has been coming from the research on Ian Waterman. And as a Rolfer, as a Feldenkrais practitioner, that aspect of feeling our body in relationship to gravity and in the relationship to the environment, into the 3-dimensional space. Is my right shoulder more forward? Is my arm more bent than the other one? These questions have been very important. And it has only been in the last 10 years. It was actually, I think that was the first article that Heike Jäger and I wrote together for the first edition of the Elsevier book, Fascia, the Tensional Network, where we try to summarize the current research available at that time. It was 2009, I think, or 2008, on interoception research from my former field of psychology, for manual and movement therapists in the fascia field. And we felt really excited. And since then, of course, the whole field has taken a very different direction, because many people have discovered it's interoception is all free nerve endings. Proprioception can be free nerve endings, but most of them are encapsulated nerve endings, like muscle spindles, Golgi, Pacini, and Ruffini endings. But there are some free nerve endings. A lot of them are in our gut, in our enteric nervous system or brain, and they communicating less to the somatomotor cortex and telling me where is my arm in space and how much Newton of loading is on my right foot compared with my left foot. But they are telling me how hungry I am, how cold my feet are, how alive I feel, how much tingling I have.
Could it also be like when you have a gut instinct, or you get butterflies in your stomach when you're in love, or things like that?
Yeah. So these body feelings who have a more emotional coloring. And there is a lot of very interesting psychological research, how much intuition, how much gut feelings are associated with the communication of the insula with the free nerve endings in various parts of your fascial system, mostly in your gut connective tissue.
So good question here, with COVID happening and, those of us who are in the touch industry and finding touch, you know what I mean? So incredibly valuable touch. And then suddenly this idea, well, if you want to stay alive, lock yourself in your house and don't go out. And how does that affect us on a neurobiological level when you're not being touched, when you're not connecting? How can that affect us, not just physiologically, but emotionally? I think there's a big connection between the two, lack of touch also altering how our brain is perceiving everything, don't you think?
No, it's very likely. So we know from Ashley Montagu and many psychologists who study lack of touch in infants, particularly in humans, in Homo sapiens, how essential that is, and how your intellectual development, actually all your other senses, are not developing well when your sense of touch is not adequately stimulated as an infant. There are not so many studies. I know several of them from my studies of psychology, how much it affects adults like you and me when we are not touched and when we are touched. And we know it is very, very powerful. But how COVID is influencing society, people at various age groups in 1 year, in 3 years, I leave that to other scientists. I would be not surprised if it shows big changes. It could be also positive changes, but for sure, there are no positive changes anywhere in biology that not also have negative changes. And the other one, we heard that together from Daniel Lieberman at the last Fascia Congress. I love this guy. Everything has a trade-off. So probably the same thing. We will find out in a couple of years the negative consequences on society, on psychological health, on the economy, on our industry, on brain development, on the marriages that our children develop and how often they get divorced after this COVID period. But I would bet with you, some people will use it to the best, and it could also be a blessing for our industry, how you call it, because already now when I teach presence courses again, there is so much appreciation. It reminds me of my frequent attempts when I was trying to get enlightened in my late 20s and trying to go to India and meditate, etc. And we were doing Vipassana retreats, sometimes for 10 days, where I was not allowed to go jogging. I was not allowed to go drinking out with friends. I was sitting and watching my perception and the nature there. And I was not allowed to talk. But when that was over, I felt it's such beautiful to communicate with other people. And when somebody touched me, I was holding their hand for 30 seconds longer than ever before.
It's so beautiful, though. I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like I so understand this. And here's another piece of this. I know that in the industry, I oftentimes hear people talking about the importance of this tissue adaptation, and I always want to propose, as much as tissue might be adapting, could it not be just that on an emotional level or a vibration level, that we are altering frequency and vibration and creating the calming of the body, bringing people from beta down into that theta state where we can shift and calm down and connect in a different way. I think if we're too high stress, it's almost like magnets that are on the same polar side, so they keep repelling one another. How do we bring ourselves together has to do with a frequency change, not necessarily a tissue change, but vibration. Yeah, I mean, like, how do you define vibration, right?
Yeah, so I would not be surprised if we also find out, at least in many of us and in many aspects where we wouldn't expect it, that this intermittent fasting in terms of touch, in terms of social contacts, this intermittent deprivation that we had, similar like if you go in a deprivation tank.
Abstinence,
I'm sure
yes.
you did that with a John Lidley deprivation tank and salt water and everything. If you come out, your senses, your appreciation for tasting things, for being in nature, for a loving human touch, has sharpened.
Indeed. Hugging trees, being near water, right? I mean, if you have a bad attitude, just go out into nature and put your feet in the dirt, and you'll feel better because you have a frequency. It's incredible concepts here. And somebody had asked me the other day, does fascia hold a memory? And I said, well, it's a thing I've heard people propose. I don't know if there's any scientific evidence of this, but what I would say is that our cells and the intracellular space, also being part of the extracellular matrix, is where communication is happening. So perhaps in the cell-to-cell communication, when cells don't communicate well, there is a change in responsiveness, in cellular neurological tissue responsiveness. So where are our emotions? Are they in our mind? Are they in our body? Is there a difference? And how do we, how can we ever measure that, right? Will there ever be a time where we could measure where our emotions are? I mean, I think we're much more than our emotions, but it seems a topic I've heard people ask quite often. Do you have a thought of that?
Yeah, I'm curious. Of course, fascia can hold keys for remembering, just like everything else. And that's called state-dependent memory, and that's nothing new. So if you get a certain smell again, suddenly you remember things that you thought you had forgotten, or you hear a sound, or you come to your grandparents' house,
right?
Yeah, and you get a certain smell in the basement, and there is a memory. So that is called state-dependent memory, and the same thing. So then, of course, the smell that you have in the basement is not the memory. It's a key to elicit your access to the memory, which is not stored in the basement of your parents. It's stored in your nervous system. And under anesthesia, you will not have a memory. And if you're dead, the tissue may be the same, and you can stimulate the tissue. Nobody will remember. So so if you work on somebody's scar, you are providing his or her nervous system with a certain configuration. To, in this case, mechanoreceptor endings, but it could be also the temperature, the cold metal, or whatever it was from the surgery, that then elicits a memory reconstruction. And that may not be true, because we know that memory is not like a photography. It is an act of reconstruction. And the links between fascia and emotions are actually very strong and also very small at the same time. And that is in the field of interoception, the whole thing about predictive coding, which has shaped the field in the last 4 or 5 years. So the insula only gets a tiny amount of new information from your body. The rest, it is projecting what you think is happening down there based on your past experiences. So it is like you are sitting there in your King's Tower, and you are looking at videos on what is happening to the country. But all these videos are made from your advisors who have never been out there, you know. And every 10 years, a little humble servant and tells them the country is very different, nobody is alive anymore, and they are very poor. But you don't allow that, because you make your projections based on how you want to see yourself. So we know that a lot of interoception is not what is really happening in terms of pH changes in your stomach. It is based on your expectations and on this predictive coding that we have. And that seems to be more important in interoception, that you experience what you expect to experience.
Yes,
not what is really happening there.
That's huge.
So that means if I, as a roving therapist, what I do with my hand almost doesn't matter, but what I invite the client to expect when I touch them, the story I tell them about. Now your fascia is turning clockwise. Now it's communicating with the Sirius and with dolphins in the ocean or whatever. So the story I make to the client is the main deal. You know, whether she goes from an agony, a painful experience, you know, where she feels the whole ankle is ruined, or her stomach is about to upset her, or whether she has been poisoned, to a healing experience under my hand, has not so much to do with the real changes in terms of mechanical stretch or in terms of the physiology that my hand created. It is about the storytelling up there. And that's more true for interoception than for proprioception. I still have my doubts about that, because it means these full of themselves esoteric gurus who feel like I have healing power, I had it already as a child, I have the best healing power of everybody in whole Europe, you know, come and get my golden hands, and I have healed everybody on this planet, and those that I didn't heal, they were full of shit and didn't want to get better. So we know all these people, you know, but they may be the better healers if the client buys their story.
That's it, right? It's belief. I mean, you know, there's this very thin line between science and belief. I always say it's a really, really, really thin line between the two. And if you believe something, but science says it is a scientific evidence that doesn't exist. Well, if your belief is stronger than the evidence that you see, it's still there, right? So if you think you're going to get better, you will. If you are in a state of fear, nothing is going to change. I'm stuck here. My life is over. And you're in that state of suffering, then nothing will change. And something that you're saying here, which was also kind of mind-blowing to me early on when I started researching fascia, was this idea that not only does our nervous system, this was something that I think was obvious, right? Our nervous system kind of anticipates how we're going to move, because we're just a repetitious system. And so it knows relatively how I'm going to get up and go get that thing and come back and all of these other things. But something that was compelling to me was this idea that fascia, independent of the nervous system, is also anticipating how we're going to move and pre-stresses and anticipates the movement so that our nervous system can adopt the information back, sensory motor feedback happens, and you move efficiently. And I think that to me is a pioneering notion that there's a tissue adaptation or a pre-stressing that's existing, and again that the fascia is functioning outside of neural responsiveness. In fact, the nervous system may actually adapt because of how the fascia pre-stresses, not the other way around. Is this something that is still a concept? Are we still looking at fascia that way, as being a pre-stressor of movement and behavior?
That would be new to me. That would be new, that fascia is doing the preparatory conditioning, or however you call it, that it would be doing that ahead of the nervous system. The evidence I have seen, it's basically the cerebellum that constantly makes an efferent copy of where my hand is supposed to be in the next split second. And when it's congruent with where I want it to be, then I continue on the same path. So you basically make feed-forward calculations all the time, just like the NASA is steering its rocket in outer space.
That makes more sense.
You calculate where your hand will be in the next split second. And when there is the deviation, 1% to the right, then you correct and you steer in the next, and then you make another pre-calculation. That is mostly done by the cerebellum, which has more cells than the forebrain, than the cerebrum. So it's a pre-calibration machine. And then based on the cerebellum's efferent copy, you change the muscle tonus in terms of a preparatory tonus regulation. And that is known. And we use the muscle spindles for this preparatory predictive coding. And we use the muscle fibers for that. Fascia is very slow in terms of responding. I spent more than 10 years to study how fast and how powerful fascia can contract by its own contractile cells, independent from the muscle fibers who are pulling. Of course, the IT band can get stiffer in a millisecond if the gluteus maximus gets tight. You know,
so we're talking like on a macro level then, like, you know, because that's, I think, also another, maybe that's also another problem in the fascial world, is that some research studies are really talking microscopically and the others are talking macroscopic. We're talking dynamic motion, gross motor patterns, gross movement, joint mobility. What about on a microscopic level? Are we looking at the extracellular matrix, what's happening in on a cellular matrix? What's the adaptation? Do we know, is this something that's being researched today?
Yeah, we spent 10 years in microanatomy, you know. So the extracellular matrix does not include the cells, as the name suggests. So it would be a surprise if that can actively extend or contract in milliseconds. So most people, and of course surprises are possible, think if rapid changes come, they are probably not coming from the stuff that has been created by the cells, like the collagen fibers and the ground substance, proteoglycans, but by the cells themselves. And we studied that for a long time, how rapidly can fibroblasts and myofibroblasts contract or expand on their own. And yes, like all cells, they can change their shape, but they do that much, much slower than skeletal muscle cells. So fascia can contract. If you give it several months' time, it can contract so powerful that a frozen shoulder needs more than 20 kilograms, and it needs more than one orthopedic surgeon to open it again.
So can we say that if you sit for long periods of time, over months, and you're always like this, that is over time, when you stand up and you still look that way, fascia is significantly playing a role over the long period of time of that deformity. And
so in months, fascia can contract.
Right.
But the question is, what about days? What about hours? What about minutes? And we know the answer. So fascia can contract with a speed of about 10 millimeters per month. And you can calculate that down. So if you want fascia to do any movement, like lift your finger, you have to wait a couple of months to do that.
So maybe if people who say, hey, you can stretch your IT band, if we just hold your leg in a position for many months and don't let you move, maybe it'll actually stretch. Is that the concept?
Sure. Yeah. And your body chemistry, if you go in an acidic environment, if your sympathetic nervous system produces more adrenaline can stimulate the fibroblast to express more TGF-beta, and TGF-beta is what then later may help them to change from fibroblasts to myofibroblasts, who can contract 4 times more.
So a neuromyofascial electrochemical system. You've got to look at
fascia can actively move by itself, independent from muscle fibers, but 10 millimeters per month. And that can be very powerful. But if you think that somebody lifts his finger, it could be fascia, or fascia would respond faster than muscles can. I have the opposite experience and measurements available at this time. And I would tend to trust our measurements because we had the opposite expectation.
Agreed.
And after more than 10 years of research, we became very humble. Yes, fascia can contract, but it's ridiculously small and ridiculously weak if you watch over a time period of a day or an hour.
And I guess that's why we talk about the elastic property, right? Is the quickness of it to come back, to actually deform for such a, to really deform. Either you'd have to have something like Ehlers-Danlos or something where the deformity is happening, or the active contractile properties perhaps, or the elastic properties are not conducive. You have a stiff to elastic property problem in general in your fascial system if you have one of these disorders. So one of the other questions I had for you, in the 2018 Congress, I thought what was maybe the first time I had finally heard researchers come up, and Neil Teese was one of the ones that talked about the fluid flow of fascia and the interstitial fluids of fascia moving into these pre-lymphatic channels into lymph, and that really there's no separation between lymph and fascia when it comes to the fluid components of it. Is that now, I'm curious where, because we went from, the first Congress really talking very much about muscles and fascia and the nervous system to more about the global nervous system components and fascia as we've moved along. And now adding lymph and trying to bring lymph and fascia into research, the oncology world. Where does, cancer likes to live in stiff fascia, and did the fascia get stiff first, or which came first, the chicken or the egg? Lots of controversy here. Where do you think in our next Fascia Congress, where do you see the industry of fascia going? What's next in pioneering information? Do you think we're headed?
Yeah, I think Neil Teese, together with Jean-Claude Guimberteau and several others, they were in the right direction, challenging our concepts on fascia, that what many people call loose connective tissue should be considered with different attention and questions than the dense fibrous collagenous connective tissues are considered. And we always included them, but we said fascia is anything between loose and dense. And it's how dense it is and how regular it is based on the local loading history. So as if it's a continuum between very, very loose and liquid and very, very dense. But now we get in the last few years an indication it's almost like 2 clusters. We have more loose connective tissue, and we have different cells included there, and they have different properties, the cells, but also the whole tissue has very different mechanical and physiological properties.
Isn't that fascinating though? I mean, that there's different layers, like our body knows to have more hyaluronan in some places and more collagen in others. It's the same properties, but the body's depositing it differently. Is that not fascinating? When I say that out loud, it blows my mind. Right?
I think so wherever you have shearing motion, you have more loose connective tissue. And if you have a joint capsule, around the joint capsule, you should have some loose connective tissue. Also inside of the joint capsule, if the joint is moving, you should have loose connective tissue. But if you don't move the tissue, if you don't have shearing motions at least 1 time per month or something like that, it will lose the liquid nature and it will become fibrotic. So I think everywhere where you have movement, you have loose connective tissue, and that's a lot in the visceral connective tissues. That's what Neil Teese studied in the beginning. But now in the latest paper, I'm sure you also noticed that he showed that the loose connective tissue, you could call it our inner ocean, in our guts, is connected with the loose connective tissue under our skin. And that was a big question that many of us had. We knew there is loose connective tissue under the skin that allows the shearing motion there. And we knew how important that is. But it was not clear how connected are they, because usually you have the dense fascia profunda between them. And several people, including me, we thought that these 2 oceans might be connected. In the front of the neck, you have the fascia profunda is not so dense as many people had assumed in the past. So there is a connection between the loose connective tissue under the skin and the visceral loose connective tissue that goes in your mediastinum and follows the aorta into your visceral connective tissue. And that's the latest paper that Neil Teese group just published 3 months ago, where they used tattoo pigments and silver colloid pigments and hyaluronan staining to show that these inner oceans are one ocean, and particles can freely move from one place to the other. So now we have one inner ocean, which is the loose connective tissue. And you have these vessels, these conduits that Peter Friedl, he doesn't call them channels, he calls them conduits because they are not round. So they are little pathways, just like animals use them when they go through the jungle. They create the pathway by their locomotion, by their migration, and then the next cell has a little bit less resistance when they follow through the jungle. So they are pathways, but they are not isolated channels like blood vessels, etc. But we need to study that liquid system. And for me, the weird aspect for all of us is that this liquid system is densely populated by actively migrating cells of our immune system, but also of a microbiome that we know already from our guts, where it's billions and billions, but we also have probably a few billion microbiomes in our body. While we sleep, they are going through our inner ocean trying to destroy us. And we have our own police, our immune cells, that is constantly chasing them down and say, if you want to stay in Robert's body, you behave. You know, I allow you to shit here because I love your shit, etc. But I want you to behave.
Exactly.
So the liquid system seems to be very much populated with friendly microbes, with neutral microbes, and with pathological microbes.
I love this.
So people who had Lyme's disease, after 20 years later, it can flare out again when they use aggressive tools like the fascia blaster. There were many people who had flashes of Lyme's disease, not because these microbiomes were new to them, but they had been confined in their inner ocean in little nests. But now they break up and they turn over everything. And this is a very important aspect.
Yes, I mean, like how huge that is what you're saying, because I think that there's a time and a place for this heavy compression, Graston technique, if you have a skilled practitioner working on one little scar, but scratching a thing all over your body to bruise yourself does not sound like a good idea. And one of the components of MELT that I feel, I always feel like science kind of catches up with an idea back when I sat with Tom Findley and said, I don't think it's so much about adapting muscles or the collagen. I think it's the fluid flow of fascia. If you can just keep the fluids moving, you're going to help boost your immune system. You'll feel better. You kind of get a little kind of a boost in your mind when you do it. You just breathe better. Your circulation is better because you're freeing up some unnecessary cellular stiffness, and you get your body a little more juicy. And that it was sort of the principle of melt, is why not, before you smash your fascia and blast your fascia and crush your body to death, why not just be gentle and explore what you feel and allow yourself more like someone is hugging you and giving you support, rather than, you know, my neck hurts, get a lacrosse ball and jam my neck with a lacrosse ball. It seems like such a more intelligent way. And for me, when I had COVID in January, I had it, and it was like a blip for me. I barely had a symptom. And I melted for like 2 hours in a day. I'd melt for a half hour. I'd sleep for 3 hours. I'd melt a little bit more. And I barely had much of a symptom except fatigue. And I really think it's from moving fluid flow. You're supporting the microbiomes. You're supporting the immune function. So far beyond a muscle concept, to me, I feel like we need to be talking about fascia and the importance of movement, because it's helping move our lymph, our immune, our neurotransmitters, the way our brain health is. I think that people who have illness, mental illness, can transform mental health, not just by going to a psychotherapist, but by touch, by exploring the body, by giving ourselves permission to go in and sense what we feel. And I think creating a new conversation because our cells are listening. I think that that's an important note for people most often, right?
Yeah.
So Robert,
we did some studies on hydration changes. We did it in our organ bars, where we stretched fascial tissues and measured the water content before the stretch, after the stretch, of course, like a sponge. Immediately after application of pressure or tension, you would expect less water in the sponge. And then you would expect, if there is water in the environment, for the sponge to soak up the water again, not in a millisecond, but maybe in a few minutes. And so we did that in the organ bars. We published that, and you can get that even in non-alive fascia, because it is a property of the ground substance. And of course, in alive fascia, it's faster. So now we are actually, yesterday we discussed again we have a bioimpedance tool where you can measure the soaking of the sponge after foam rolling, after Graston tools, after Rolfing techniques. And we did so far 3 small studies on living people. And the sponge effect is happening. After the stretch, there is less water in the stretch tissue. And 10 minutes later, it's not back yet. So it's a very slow refilling effect. And at least in organ bars, which was not a live tissue, we had shown if you dehydrate a sponge sufficiently strong and you wait sufficiently long, it can be more juicy and more wet and more resilient afterwards.
Well, we have to get melt. We need to actually apply the melt concepts and not foam rolling, because I think that the whole foam rolling idea, I'd like to actually bring back another research and add melt to one of those and see what the differences are between traditional foam rolling and the melt process, because our tensional pull and compression, I think, is very different, and it spans a little bit of a different concept. So I'm going to get on you about that.
That's easy to measure. It's relatively easy to measure the water content in your arm before application of melt or manual therapy or whatever so that is very sensitive.
I'm ready to do it.
Yeah.
So Robert, what's your next thing with the Fascia Research Project? Because now this is a new thing that you guys have begun working on, and definitely making new changes. What's on tap for you for the next year or 2, I suppose, before the next Congress? What's happening in your world?
I've become more a networker than a single hero. You know, I love to be a hero who makes discovery and then shares it with his friends. But now I've become more a mentor for young pioneers who love to have that role in them conquering new territory. And I have a very good hand so far in picking out the right conquerors and supporting them. but also telling them to slow down, please. You might be fighting against the wrong dog here, and
Well,
supporting them and linking them. So that has been, I learned that a lot from also Tom Findley. He loved at least as much to support people like you, like many other scientists, based on his extensive network and experience, as he did discovering things himself. So that's in my life, I've become more and more skilled, and I'm learning how can I support networking in our community. For me, the slogan, if you want to be successful and have a lot of fun in understanding fascia as a networking organ, that you learn the most if you become a good networker within your own communication structure and networking structure, and publication, how many people you quote, etc. That has worked very well. So for me, that is a learning curve there.
As
we had in the last half a year, we had more interest with yin yoga in yoga people than with manual therapists, which was basically my background. And there have been 3 papers recently that the limitations to joint range of motion in old people seems to be completely different than in young people. Old means 60 years like me, young means 20 years.
Yes, exactly. That's what I always say when they're talking about older adults and you see 50 and over, and I'm like, damn, I'm over there now. I want to go back over to the young side. Well, we'll stay vibrantly young, I'm sure, for a long period of time. Well, Robert, I just first, honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I just so appreciate all of the contributions that you've done for me personally, and just the support that you've always brought to me. So thank you for that. And of course, just for pioneering and for continuing on and always being such a light in the industry and bringing such fun and vibrancy. You just are just so abundant with it. And so I just appreciate every bit of you and all that you've done to just support an entire industry. So thank you.
And you and I, we have an obligation to continue the mission that Tom Findley expressed so much in our community. And that is the humble curiosity. Actually, his ex-wife now, Patricia, she told me about the last days and last hours of Tom Findley, and he approached death with the same discoverer curiosity that he worked as a scientist. He wanted to find out about dying, but he knew, I'm getting into new territory, not making up his mind on what's the other side. He wanted to learn. So he was partly sad to leave us, of course, but there was also a sparkling eye in him to say, I'm going into a new adventure. And I think we have an obligation to keep the spirit of discovery and curiosity alive in our community.
Most certainly, also with losing Leon Chaitow, who I think was always one of those people who so long ago, when I was questioning all of these things, and he said to me, I'm not sure how to answer your question, but keep asking the questions and I'm sure you'll find your answer. And that to me, I think also was Tom. He was really so instrumental in so many strokes of the development of MELT. Really forever grateful for him. And I can honestly say that I just believe that when we get out of this human experience and we're out of this shell, we are just right in front of everything, just in a spirit form. And I'm sure that he is continuously going to be sprinkling his frequency and energy out to our industry. So we certainly will not let his work disappear. There's no doubt so many of us will continue to share his legacy because it's a big one.
And what you are doing, Sue, is also very important. And I think you are aware that Tom he had only very few studies of clinicians that he supported as strongly as he did the publication that he did together with you. Because you are not only a very, very talented missionary, but you keep reaching many people. You know how the suffering and the hopes they have, and the values they have, and you link them to the wider concept of people who have been thinking outside of the box, to the insights of Jaap van der Wal, Gil Hadley, Tom Findley, Helen Larcher. So that is a big contribution that you are having. So I must share, Tom, that you are not just one of many people who are doing fascia education. You are a real gifted pioneer, and keep going. And if you want any scientific support, measuring the water content, we need to continue.
I'm going to give you a call right after we're done. For certain we will. I know that we have a lot of work to do. And if it's one thing I think as a mission is to continue to keep sharing both Leon Chaitau's work and Tom Findley's work. I think it's just so utterly essential, because it's just, I think it's, I don't think I'd be here without those two, and also with what you've done. I mean, really, you guys are amazing people. So thank you for everything you do. Thanks. So everybody, again, Robert, thank you so much. And for those of you listening, we'll be back next week with another anatomical gangster conversation. And thanks all for listening.